I knew I'd get at leleast one person wanting to sit down and talk about Grease when I packed my copy of the soundtrack LP and brought it to the EPS Podcast Live a few days after Olivia Newton John passed away. And I was right, actually getting two different people wishing to share their nostalgia for this nostalgia film. This is the EPS Podcast, and you're listening to the second short of the second season. The movie Grease has stayed consistently popular since its release in 1978, but has received more attention recently after the passing of Olivia Newton John, who starred in the musical opposite John Travolta. Take a listen to what my guests had to say about seeing the movie for the first time and carrying the music with them for the past 4 decades. Here at Strawberry Bank Museum in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and doing my on-the-spot live EPS podcast with some visitors to the museum, and I have Marie Cecile you're from Manchester?
I work in Manchester.
That's right.
From where?
You're from where? Mm-hmm. And here in New Hampshire, a lot of people use that, like, where?
Yes.
I'm sure you've heard that. It's not the first time you've ever heard that, right?
First time I've heard that.
So I brought an assortment of things today, and actually before I left the house, I made a point to grab this particular item that you chose because, sadly, last week, Olivia Newton John
I know. That made me sad.
Passed away. And so you selected the soundtrack album to the movie Grease.
Yes.
And that is a staple. I think ever since that movie came out,
yes.
It's like a staple in every collection. Everybody has to have it.
Yeah.
So the question that we chose to talk about today is, who is the intended audience or user? And it's not as simple as it may seem, who the intended audience or user of. What's your first impression as to who it was meant for?
My first impression was that I know when I saw it, I was probably not the intended user, but I don't know if we had ratings back then. I don't know if they had like strict ratings.
Right.
And I know that my parents were very super strict Catholics. So had they known what this movie was about, mm-hmm. they wouldn't have let like their child come to see this movie.
Right.
And I saw this movie with my older sister first, then with friends. I think I saw when it came out, I think I saw it about like 5 times.
Oh boy.
And I'm saying this right now because I love this movie so much. We sung the songs, and we did little shows about it. And then when my daughter was, I think, 6, I said, "Oh my God, this is a wonderful movie.
Yeah.
Let's watch it together." And I started watching it. I was
like, "Oh."
Yes, I'm like, "Oh, yeah, you can't watch this right now."
Because almost from the very beginning of the movie, it has innuendo and...
I don't know, like that, yeah. It's not even innuendo. It's like blatancy.
Yeah.
Blatant, like, sexual overtones.
Right. And
like the Grease Lightning song.
Oh, man, that... I remember...
I guess I never heard the lyrics until I watched it with my child, and I'm like, oh, we cannot...
You're going to have a lot of questions after this. And it's funny because this is like the Grease the movie is like the second or third iteration of the story. So there was a musical play on Broadway called Grease for a little while. Yeah, early 70s. And then they made it for the movie. And then when Grease returned back in the 90s, it was based on the movie. So the same kind of thing happened with Hairspray too, where it started out as a movie, made it into a musical, and then they made the musical into a movie. It's like this weird back and forth. And it fits perfectly into the 1970s because for that time period, people were so nostalgic for the 50s.
And that's what it was. Like, the whole... Like, there's still, I know every single song from this movie.
But it was like the real 50s that were being represented because I think...
It was like the cuteness and that Summer Lovin' song, and, I don't know. It was just so much, it was fun.
Yeah.
It was fun. And then that whole amusement park ending, and she's walking through with the black leather because she's changed.
Yeah.
But then that whole Rizzo part with that she thinks that she's pregnant. And all, it was like a big gamut of things that like you wouldn't expect like 10, 11, 12-year-olds to go see. But I'm telling you, my friends and I saw it several times when it came out.
I feel like movies like that, nostalgia pieces.
And your parents were like, as long as you're back before the lights, that was like you could go anywhere. It was a lot more. I felt that children had a lot more access of freedom to go wherever they want, and they could be trusted. And it was maybe like a safer period of time,
Late 70s, it was before Stranger Danger really, hit. And
I'm sure there were kidnappings and things that happened that were bad, but your parents weren't really over concerned as long as you were like outside and playing and doing a lot of active things outside. As long as you came back home by dinner time. And
in some ways, they were probably in favor of this kind of movie being seen because it was more representative of what they grew up with.
Yeah.
So the parents of the 70s were the teenagers of the 50s.
Yeah.
And
I don't know. I don't think my mother would have.
Yeah. Well, when you watch movies and television shows that were made in the 50s that take place then.
And I love that.
They make it really clean and make it seem very watch and those TV shows are almost made fun of for how perfect everything was and
that. Like I'm a big old movies buff, so I like the old Andy Hardy ones.
Mm-hmm.
Like let's make a musical because I was like when I went to school I was a theater major and so I did a lot of theater, so I was like all into that Judy Garland, Andy Hardy, like Mickey Rooney stuff, and Shirley Temple. I mean, it was before my time. I gravitated towards old movies. I saw that on your table too. You had like a Gene Kelly movie.
Yep, on the Town.
Yeah, on the Town, and I've seen it, and like all those with Fred Astaire. So this was like just right up my alley.
And it works well too because musical movies had kind of lost their they stopped being made after a while. It seemed like
this gave it a rebirth.
Exactly, and so Grease did that, and so the album itself obviously it was made for people who saw the movie, loved the music, and wanted to listen to it all the time. And it's kind of funny because very rare does so it's about the rock and roll era, the birth of the rock and roll era. Back then, you wouldn't have Broadway, musical competing with rock and roll on the radio in the 50s, but by the 70s. Those songs that you mentioned, like "Summer Lovin'" and "You're the One That I Want," were on the radio.
All
they
the
were,
time,
and people loved it because
it was so much fun.
It brought them right back to the simpler times, quote unquote. Of the 50s.
But if you look at the movies, they weren't really. I don't know. They weren't really dealing with really simple issues.
Right.
That was funny.
That's what's so
dropout. I mean, it was like
And I think it's
but they made it fun. I don't know. Like they made. And maybe the music made the sadness fun. I don't know.
It gives appreciation, I think, because nostalgia and amnesia tend to go hand in hand. When people think of their own childhoods, like I just was talking about the LA Olympics and the 80s in general. Like they were my youth, so I don't think about negative things that happened then. I don't think about even in my everyday life. It's always just kind of washed over as like, oh, it was perfect. Everything was great. I think of another nostalgia movie that came out in the early 1990s called Now and Then.
Ooh,
it's with Christina Ricci.
And there's 4 girls.
Right. And it's like... And
is it Rosie O'Donnell?
Rosie O'Donnell's in it. What's her face from... Used to be married to Bruce Willis. Demi Moore is... And... Tom Hanks's wife is in it, and Rita Wilson and Melanie Griffith are all in it, and they play the adult versions
of the children.
And then they go back to 1970 in the when they're looking back on it, and so it's like it's around the same time as the Wonder Years too.
Yes,
was a big hit.
There was a lot of that kind of nostalgia, like Happy Days.
Yeah, Happy Days was a huge hit in the 70s, and American Graffiti was a huge hit. Because it brought people back to that simpler time, but then also highlighted, okay, it wasn't as saccharine sweet as you might have thought. Yeah. Like it, and that's kind of the whole point of what I do in this podcast is pointing out, so that Grease, the movie, and the soundtrack are about the 50s. They're inspired by the 50s, but it came out in the 70s. So it actually tells us more about the 70s than it does about the 50s, because it's the 70s interpretation of that era. And then Now and Then was the same thing. It was the 90s looking back on the 70s. So it actually tells us more about the early 90s than it does about 1970 in Indiana, where it takes place. Definitely. It's.
But I remember absolutely. I mean, still loving it. Yeah.
I think about there's a great sitcom. It didn't last very long, around the turn of the century, called Grounded for Life. I don't know if you
yes.
remember that one.
Yeah, the man and he has like 3 kids.
Yeah,
yes.
and the daughter, she has a fit one day,
and they go to Catholic school.
Yep, exactly. Yep. So, and she's mad at her parents for something, and she throws all of her CDs down the staircase, and they go over and they're like, "Is the Grease soundtrack ruined?" And they're like, "Yep, it's broken in half." And they go, "Yes!" Like, now we don't have to hear it all the time, But because it's not just that era, that embraced that music. It's on and on. And like we said at the beginning of this, when Olivia Newton John passed away, of course,
I know, but she was there.
This was the movie that everybody remembered her for.
Yeah, definitely. Because I don't think I remember for anything before that. And then after that, I think she made
Xanadu.
Xanadu.
I've never.
And that whole "Let's Get Physical" video.
Yeah, I remember that. Like, it's like one of those, and those two things are always kind of made fun of.
Yeah.
It's ultimately like Gen X thing to be like, oh yeah, Xanadu. Like I think it's on an episode of Friends or something. And whereas Grease is held up as as it should be because it's so good.
Oh my god, yeah, it was so good.
And
John Travolta, I know he was that Saturday Night Fever before or after?
Right around the same time. I want to say it was like one followed the other.
And because you know what, Welcome Back, Kotter.
Yeah, that's where he was. He did a great when he appeared early '90s, right around the time Pulp Fiction came out. He was the host of Saturday Night Live, and he does a great intro at the beginning where he he's like, oh, you gotta forget about the past, but then as he's doing it, he keeps acting out all of his different roles, and like he puts on a hat and he's like as urban cowboy, and then is it Urban Cowboy? No, that's the other one. Anyway, and then at the end he does the disco stance, And then at the end of the episode, and it stinks because now because of limitations on...
That's the move.
My son's been doing it. He's 7.5. He has no...
She's 10 and she knows the move.
They do that disco move. I used to do it all the time to make fun of an era that I didn't even live through. But
I lived through it.
The 70s. But the end of the episode, and you can't find it now because of they have the copyrights on the music.
Okay.
But Seal was the guest, the musical guest for that episode.
I love him too.
And at the end of the episode, the whole cast is there as they're waving to the audience at the end of SNL, and then they go "Wah bop baloo bop, wah bam," and they recreate the ending of Grease.
Yeah.
And they put a blonde wig on Seal, and they're waving as they drive away into the rafters, just like Danny and Sandy.
Yeah.
So it was like, if that doesn't say the impact that Grease made, and I can't help but think that this.
It's like, oh my gosh.
Putting it on vinyl like that helped.
When she maybe let me go see, she would. I don't know.
It's almost like the tides of the ocean, though, when it comes to. Kind of cultural acceptance of things, or society kind of slowly easing up its feelings of like what should be tolerated and what's not. It's like a little bit at a time. It comes in and then it recedes a little bit, and then it, next time it comes in, it's a little bit further in.
But it goes also to show that when you're young, you don't tune in on all those other things that. Because I would have never.
Right. There's no reason that you wouldn't have the context for it to.
And as an adult, I was like.
We, raising children nowadays, it is so much harder to, because back then that was pretty much, you had two choices to watch a movie, either in the theater or when it came on TV at some point. And even then, but now with streaming and even before that with so VHS and DVD and all that, it's like, how do I know, so that's where the rating system really came into play.
That's why I said I don't think this was even.
Yeah. And if it was, it wasn't. I can't imagine it.
I imagine I can remember we were 10, 11, 12 going to that age group going to see this movie by ourselves without
even if the movie was rated, the record definitely wasn't. So
no.
you could have.
The movie was because so you
you go to the record store and buy this
or PG-13. I think
because
there was no parent with us. We just took a bus and went to the movies.
And they were like, okay.
All right. Be home by dinner. I'll be home too late.
So that's so fun. It's amazing what one record can and one question can bring us.
It's just a lot of memories.
That's what I'm here for. Thank you so much for sitting down and doing this.
Thank you
and
very much. This is a fun opportunity.
Yeah.
Look at this. Another thing that we could do. We've been on a podcast.
That's fun.
Summer.
You didn't expect that when you woke up
No,
this morning,
I
right?
know. We did not.
Thanks again.
Oh, thank you very much.
Grease gives us some idea of teenage life in the 1950s, but as a nostalgia film, there's plenty of romanticizing of the era involved. Instead, it is a better resource to learn about society and culture of the late 1970s, because that is when it was made. For instance, many of us born after the 1970s have the perception that traditional American family values were challenged and had eroded completely by the time Grease came out. But hearing from my guests that they were surprised, felt a level of guilt being allowed to go see a movie with language and sexuality that Grease offers, tells me that those perceptions are not necessarily true. The soundtrack album allowed these young people to possess the content of the movie for themselves, the same way their parents hid away the more risque rock and roll music of their era, of their youth, that Grease's music is based on. I know, and
I didn't realize this was written and produced by Barry Gibb.
Oh, that's right, because he didn't. So I'm recording now, but so I'm here with. Oh, it's fine. Teresa and Brent, and they came in and to Strawberry Bank Museum. You said you came here just on a whim, right? You just kind of see what's going on, and so glad that you stopped in, and you had no idea that there was a podcast going on that you were going to get roped into, and so. Just like I guessed earlier today, and I predicted this when I brought it with me, I brought the Grease soundtrack on record. And I'm like, because of, unfortunately, a couple of weeks ago, Olivia Newton John passed, I figured this would be a good time to analyze some of her work. And so that caught your eye, the soundtrack. Do you have a copy of your own at home?
I do.
How long after watching the movie did it take you to buy the record?
Months, I would say. I saw the movie probably, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 times.
That's probably, because when it first came out, there wasn't VHS.
Right.
And even if there was, it would cost like $120 to buy it, and there wasn't rental stores. So you'd watch a movie as many times as you could in the theater, knowing that it wasn't going to be on TV for a long time.
Right.
And so this is almost like, because the way the record's laid out is in order of how it's performed in the movie. Mm-hmm. So it's almost like you could watch, quote unquote, the movie by listening to the record, right?
To the record. Mm-hmm.
So that in itself, I mean, we're almost done actually. We can get something out of that. But we can just quickly, so the question that we said we would talk about is, who made it, and what was their role or status in society? So there's a couple of makers behind this, aren't there? Well, the name that you just when we started recording was Barry Gibb, right?
Barry Gibbs.
And also involved in most of those songs would be John Travolta, Olivia Newton John, and the company that made the movie itself was Paramount Pictures, and really none of those were nobodies by the time that movie came out. I mean, this really helped Travolta launch his career from being just a TV star from Welcome Back, Kotter to then, movie fame
star.
And stuff.
Yeah.
Did this come out before or after Saturday Night Fever? We were trying to figure that out earlier. I probably should just use the internet, but
I don't know. What was the year? It was 1978, it looks like.
So I feel like it might have been the same year. I feel like
real close. I'm thinking it was right after.
Yeah.
Okay, so Grease came after the other one.
That's what I was thinking.
Yep.
Because and so this was an interesting time period when it came to movies. The 70s movies had kind of gone away by that point as like the main attraction, right? Because the golden age of film, 1930s through the 50s. But right when TV started to really show that it could do more than just take the old radio shows and put them into, visuals, people were like, well, why am I going to go to the theater if I can get entertainment of the same caliber at home? And the 70s, by the time you roll into the 70s, the movie industry was really sluggish. It didn't have nearly the same appeal as TV did, or as the movie industry once did have. By the end of the decade, though, you said you went to the movies 15 times to see Grease?
To see it.
And the year before that, Star Wars. I mean, Star Wars had a big deal with bringing people back to the theater.
It did.
Because, if they could only, you can only watch it in a big screen, for its real.
Oh, absolutely.
So tell me a little bit about what does all of this information tell you that a big company like Paramount would get big rising stars, that they would have a modern, because Barry Gibb was relevant in the late 70s. He wasn't like a carryover. And the scene I always like the most is the dance scene where they have Sha Na Na is playing, was it Johnny Casino and the Gamblers, right? And they do the hand jive. And they are another example of like that 50s nostalgia that's come back alive in the 70s. Yep. So what does that all tell you about the society, American society in the late 70s?
They wanted that connection to the people's past that they kind of either they grew up in or their parents grew up in.
And we were talking before that it's not a overly bleached version of the past either. Almost immediately as soon as the movie starts, you get a little bit of swearing. There's some innuendo. There's some outright, sexual stuff going on. Because if you relied only on media that was produced in the 50s, there was a lot more censorship. Yeah. And that was another thing that made the movie industry flourish in the 70s, is they're like, you can see things on the movie screen that TV would never allow.
Yeah, that's right.
Because there's a lot more control of the audience that comes into a theater versus like if a bunch of little kids started 2 tickets for Grease, please. They'd be like, "Where's your parents?" I don't know if they had a rating system quite yet. At least one that wasn't adhered to by all by that time. But it was still,
I bet they did.
Some way of vetting, who can come to see this, and The Godfather. You couldn't show that on TV. Any of that kind of stuff. So yeah, do you think that we're sitting in a history museum. This place was opened in the mid-1960s. The buildings that we're in, the one we're in right now, was built circa, I think, late 1700s, if not early 1800s. There is this desire to stay connected to the past, even if it's not one that you yourself experienced. So, when Olivia Newton John passed away a few days ago, there was an outpouring of people feeling bad about it. Even people who had never grew up watching her, they didn't go see Grease when it first came out. They listened to the album. They watched the movie on VHS or on TV or all the other versions. So it's like, I feel like that component to our culture has remained intact. That it's, we have to, we want to be connected to something even if we weren't there ourselves. So, do you think that this music from Grease will continue for generations to come?
I hope. I hope it does.
Yeah.
I hope.
What's your favorite song off that album / movie?
Hold on.
You're the one
I think my favorite is Summer Nights.
That's a good one.
I like Summer Nights. Yeah.
Do you have a favorite that you dig?
The one that I would come to my mind is "You're the One That I Want."
Yeah, and both of those songs really, they showed up on the radio, which is not. It was kind of unique, because they don't stand out as movie songs.
Right.
They could stand alone as a and I hear them all the time now.
Yeah.
You listen to a lot of the oldies stations, which don't get me started on that. Like what they consider, I don't know, where you live, if there's some oldie stations that are starting to play stuff from the 80s. I'm like, no. Oldies is 50s and 60s. Even the 70s I don't consider oldies. That's classic, but they're doing that more and more. And every now and then you might hear a song from Grease show up. And
once in a while.
It's unmistakable that the bass line for The One I Want, as soon as that comes on, you're like, yep, I know what that is, And it's, so in Barry Gibb, I maybe was mistaken. Was he part of the Bee Gees?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, that is him.
Was he the oldest?
He was the oldest.
And so they did the entire soundtrack for Saturday Night Fever. Yeah. So there must have been, they were very relevant in that era.
Yeah, that was during what was the disco era, which was a very short-lived, popular thing.
But strangely, that's one thing that really seems to stand as the 70s. People are like, "Oh, 70s equal disco," when it kind of was born and died in the 70s. It didn't. Maybe that's why they connected so well.
As somebody having graduated from high school in 1979, I can tell you that it kind of was born in maybe in 76, right around the time when some of these movies came out, and Saturday Night Fever. Yeah. And it was almost a bad word by 1980. Like, you didn't want to be known to like it. It was like you were weird if you'd
see those stickers like Disco Sucks, and they had Disco Demolition Night in Chicago. Yeah. Which is a whole other thing. I could do an analysis of that, but because it's funny, because like the opening song, Grease, to the movie, and I assume the soundtrack is by you have it right in front of you, but it's Frankie Valli, right? Mm-hmm. And it's definitely not a disco song necessarily, but it doesn't really sound like a 50s song. The open, Grease is the word, has its own, like, it's a modern song, which coming from him, you would think that he would be all on board with making a 50s, early 60s style song. Right. But, that opening song, so it almost sets it up right from the beginning that this is a nostalgia movie, right? And that opening cartoon sequence, and the really, it's drawn in the style of the 50s, like those kind of, underground cartoons a little bit, but it's like showing a more realistic version of 50s teenagers. They were up to no good sometimes. They were acting like teenagers of any time period. And, and the music is like saying, basically, do you remember when we did this stuff? And so the soundtrack to the album is not just for them, the people, the nostalgic, but it's also for the people who are, growing up in that time period and saying, hey, I want to... in fact, the woman who did Grease earlier with us, so we have a connection now. They also chose Grease. We're doing a different question. But it is... it definitely has maintained itself, hasn't it, as a great document of two time periods, right? The 50s and the 70s.
Together,
and by analyzing and overanalyzing what we just did, I just ruined Grease for somebody else. So, thank you for joining on this short podcast.
Thank you.
Hope you listen to the show, as everybody who's listening right now should.
EPS.
There it is. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you for listening to this short episode of the EPS Podcast. Episodes like this one come out on Tuesdays. Longer, full-length episodes where we do a deep dive into primary sources arrive on Thursdays. If you like what you hear, consider becoming a patron by going to patreon.com/EPS Podcast. Share and follow wherever you can, and follow the program on social media, including YouTube and especially Instagram. I look forward to you tuning in again to the EPS Podcast, where everything is a primary source.